And a lot of our colleagues have been coming down to the floor today and yesterday talking about two things that are actually very connected. The VA mission bill that we just passed, that's going to significantly transform how we treat our veterans, how we make sure our vets are getting the care that they've earned and that they deserve, and also appropriately, as that bill just passed the Senate and is heading to the President's desk, that we're also talking about Memorial Day and the Memorial Day weekend that is fast approaching, a very important, sacred time for our country and certainly my state, the great state of Alaska. What I'd like to do, Mr. President, is talk a little bit about the bill and then reflect a little bit more on the importance of Memorial Day as we move forward into this weekend. One of the things that we all do is certainly with regard to legislation like that, we look at the national implications, but we also look at how our own constituents can be impacted and make sure their interests are served when there's broader national legislation that we've been working on for months. Many of us have been working on this bill for almost a year now. The presiding officer and I are on the Veterans Affairs Committee, so we were very focused on it. My state, we proudly claim more veterans per capita than any state in the country, but we also have unique challenges. Alaska is a very, very big place. And with regard to enabling our veterans to get the health care they need and the services they need from the VA, it can be a challenge. So one of the things that we worked hard on is to make sure that just because you're a vet and you live in a big state in a very rural part of America, it still means that you should get the benefits that you've earned as a veteran. So, Mr. President, a number of things in the bill, the VA Mission Act that we just passed, focuses on the unique elements of Alaska. Let me just give you a couple examples that are now in the law, in legislation, and it's going to be signed by the President here in a couple days. The bill requires access to community care, non-VA care, where the VA does not operate a full-service facility in the state. Well, there's no full-service VA facility in Alaska. So what this enables our veterans to do is to get care from other medical service providers, particularly our members, our veterans who are in some of the more rural parts of the state. It has a specific Alaska fee schedule. When there's reimbursement by providers, because healthcare costs are structurally so much higher in my state and transportation costs, there's a fee schedule the VA uses in this bill that's just for Alaska. It continues the ability for the VA to have tribal sharing agreements with members of tribal organizations that, again, have very far reach, provide excellent care to so many Alaskans, both Alaska natives and non-natives. By the way, Alaska natives serve at higher rates in the U.S. military than any ethnic group in the country. Incredible special patriotism from those constituents in my state that we're all very, very proud of. The bill creates the standards for timely payments to community care providers. So one of the big challenges we've had in the VA is that non-VA medical providers provide care to veterans and then the VA doesn't reimburse them for months. This causes enormous challenges, including collection agencies calling the very veterans that got the care and service. Completely unacceptable, and we're trying to change that, and this bill will do it. And finally, Mr. President, a bill that I had with Senator Tester from Montana was called the Serving Our Rural Veterans Act. This is now part of the broader bill. And what this does is it creates VA residency programs in states like Alaska, like Montana, that don't have medical schools, where there are very few residency programs. Studies show that when doctors go do their residency, well over 50% of those docs stay in the state where they do their residency programs. So that's a great advantage if you have a lot of residency programs. Well, we don't. And so what this bill does is it sets up a pilot program by the VA to work with Native health organizations, DoD health organizations, IHS health organizations, and establish residency programs through the VA where we can get doctors to Alaska who will do service for our veterans and then stay. So those are just a few examples, Mr. President, of how this bill not only helps our veterans nationwide, but certainly helps the veterans in my state. Of course, the implementation of this bill is going to be key. And one thing that concerns me, to be frank, is that right now there's very little leadership at the highest levels of the VA. As a matter of fact, we've had 4 secretaries in 4 years. We need to start putting established, secure leaders in the VA to start implementing this important piece of legislation. We will continue the oversight role in the Congress, but this is a good start. And Mr. President, more importantly, this bill also sends a strong message to our veterans throughout the country that the senators in this body, Democrats and Republicans, are focused on them, have their back, as do Americans all across the nation. And this is what I want to talk about for the remainder of my remarks this afternoon. Looking at, on the eve of Memorial Day weekend, and reflecting for a little bit here on the Senate floor about the ebb and flow of how we as Americans have treated our veterans and memorialized their service, because that's what this weekend is all about. Now, we know, and we continue to always have lionized and celebrated our World War II veterans and the over 400,000 Americans who gave their lives defending freedom. That's who we're thinking about this weekend during World War II. From ticker tape parades when they came home to honor flights that continue today, this greatest generation of Americans, both living and dead, have received the respect and honor that all of our veterans should have. And with good reason. With good reason. They literally help. Their sacrifice saved the world from authoritarian takeovers, whether it was Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. And so we've always had the greatest generation up here in terms of how we view them, how we memorialize them, the veterans and those who gave the ultimate sacrifice. Then just 5 years later, Mr. President, came the Korean War. And the respect that we gave to the tens of thousands of veterans returning home from Korea, it started to decline. It started to decline. Something to akin to benign neglect. Many parts of American society during that time seemed as if they didn't want to be bothered with what was going on in Korea, or didn't want to think about the tens of thousands who were killed in action, the over 8,000 who are still declared missing in action, and the over 100,000 American service members wounded in the Korean War. This is reflected even today in the name that many historians have given this conflict, the Forgotten War. The Forgotten War. Now, Mr. President, I've never liked that phrase. I think it's actually borderline disrespectful. The better way to memorialize the sacrifice of our Korean War veterans is in the words etched into the marble of the incredibly moving Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., just a few miles from here. That memorial, for those who haven't visited, I highly recommend you do. For those who are visiting Washington, particularly on this weekend, it's great to go down there. But there's a simple phrase there. Freedom is not free. Freedom is not free. And if this weekend means anything, it's the importance of that phrase on the Korean War Memorial. That memorial also states, quote, "Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. If you want to see an example of American bravery and what it meant, just take a look at the difference between North and South Korea today. There's a satellite photo. It's very famous. It shows the Korean Peninsula at night. The North is dark, even today, dark. The South is full of light and vibrancy and energy. And the reason that happened to this day is because of the bravery and the service and sacrifice of American military members. These are all powerful words on the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and to me, the rightful tribute to that war and our veterans. It shouldn't be called the Forgotten War. It should be called the Noble War. Because think about what our young men and women did. As I mentioned, sent overseas to, quote, defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. And to this day, our troops are on the peninsula right now keeping the peace, 28,000 of them. So we had this benign neglect in the Korean War, Mr. President, and then what happened? Well, then came the Vietnam War. And we all know what happened, and yet to this day, we really don't know why it happened. Our country kind of went off kilter. And in terms of the honor and respect we showed our Vietnam veterans and their wounded and fallen comrades, America hit rock bottom. World War II here, Korean War, benign neglect, Vietnam, disgraceful conduct. To the men and women serving in the military. We've all heard the stories. They're sad, they're tragic. We've all heard the stories of young men and women who went to serve their country and fight overseas in Vietnam, come home to protesters, being spit on, called baby killers. I remember hearing about one such episode from a senior Marine officer when I was a young Marine infantry lieutenant. And he came home from combat, met his dad at the airport, who was a World War II veteran. He was in his service alphas, the green uniform that Marines wear, sea bag over his shoulder. Dad was with him. Came outside on the airport, some protesters there, someone threw red paint on him and his father. Think about that. On a young man and his dad who just came home from fighting in Vietnam, that's what he got. But Mr. President, here's the amazing thing, and it's why our country owes such a debt of gratitude to our Vietnam veterans. Instead of being racked and incapacitated by bitterness and anger, these veterans did something amazing, something remarkable. They set out to make sure that future veterans of America's wars and their fallen comrades would receive better attention and better treatment and better respect than they did. They made it their mission in life that we as a nation would once again honor our military like we honored the veterans coming home in World War II at the highest level. That's what they did. And here's the amazing thing. They succeeded. They succeeded. And we need to really be thinking about our Vietnam veterans and our Vietnam killed in action this Memorial Day. Again, for those who haven't been there, you want to go to a moving memorial about America's war sacrifices, the war dead. There's nothing more moving than the Vietnam War Memorial. And I've seen this throughout my own military career. As someone who's seen what our Vietnam veterans have done for the next generation of veterans. When we've come home from doing our duty It's the Vietnam veterans who are there, making sure that the current generation of American soldiers, American warriors, gets the respect and honor that these veterans never got. Let me give you one example. Many years ago, I was commanding a Marine recon unit in Alaska. I had one of my soldiers, one of my sergeants, one of my Marines, was a great Marine who was killed. And we had a memorial service, a small memorial service, for this young Marine sergeant at Fort Richardson. It was outside. We were in our dress blues. It was a very somber service. 4 guys pull up on Harley Davidsons, motorcycles. They're older. They just pull up on their bikes, and they just sat there through the whole service. Very, very powerful presence. And at the end of the service, they came up to me. I was a captain at the time. And they asked if I was a senior officer there. I was. And I just asked them, thanks for coming here. Well, what are you doing here? Did you know my sergeant? And they said, no. We just read about the service in the paper today, and we wanted to be here to show our respect and honor for this young Marine sergeant. Think about that. Vietnam vets who weren't treated well at all, when they came home, making sure one Marine Corps sergeant in Alaska got the respect and dignity that he deserved as a veteran. Our Vietnam vets used their painful experience to become our nation's guardians of military respect, honor, and dignity. So right now, where are we as a country? Well, I think we're back at that high level. I think we're back at that high level of not only respecting members of the military, veterans, active duty, reserves, but certainly our wounded and fallen warriors. And Mr. President, it's in large measure because of the efforts and sacrifice and courage of our Vietnam veterans. So we can't thank them enough. And as Alaska's senator, I'm so honored to represent so many veterans and so many Vietnam veterans. But what I think is important here on the Senate floor to talk about again as we move into Memorial Day weekend, let us resolve, not just as a community in places like Alaska, but as a country, as a Senate, that we will always, always stay at this high level of respect for our fallen and our veterans and their families, and particularly those who have given the ultimate sacrifice in the men and women, wives, husbands, children they have left behind. I think it's also important that even though we're back as a nation at this very high level, you always hear it. You always hear it. It's always in the background where some start to question the service and sacrifice of America's military. You've heard it a little bit when ISIS was running amok in Iraq and Syria. And you heard some people say, geez, we took these places with a lot of blood and treasure. Now they've fallen to terrorists. Was that worth the cost to the young men and women who died in those battles? Did our soldiers, Marines, sailors die in vain? I think it's really important to answer that question right here on the Senate floor. And it's something I hope we can all agree on. No American who has ever worn the uniform of our country to fight for freedom and defend our nation and die for this country, whether at Valley Forge, Iwo Jima, Waste City, Ramadi, Fallujah, has ever died in vain. Mr. President, we always need to remember that, particularly as we're coming upon Memorial Day weekend. And I just want to thank again all the members of the military, their families, who protected our freedom for centuries and will continue to do so. We're working hard in the Senate to make sure our veterans are taken care of. This VA Mission Act that we just passed is going to the President's desk for his signature. It's part of that commitment, that sacred commitment we have to our veterans and their families. And I want to thank them all as we come upon Memorial Day weekend. I yield the floor.